and ensuring Ukraine wins. Thank you.
Jonathan Djanogly.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. As we rejoice at the liberation of Kherson, we need to be mindful that Ukraine is still very much a country at war. As Russian Federation tanks rolled across the border onto sovereign Ukraine territory on the 24th of February, the world bore witness to an attack against the post-Second World War settlement of a magnitude and a kind without precedent. And I congratulate the government on the superb and consistent support that the UK has provided to Ukraine. But the situation constantly changes, and I believe that we now need a rethink on sanctions. I frequently hear people, including UK ministers, saying that this is Putin's war, not that of the Russian people, thereby laying the blame of an entire nation's aggression at the feet of one man. This is an aggression, we must not forget, that seeks to erase Ukraine from the map, destroy its culture, turn back the clock to a period when the Russia-centric Soviet Union dominated Eastern Europe and its peoples. Having had the opportunity to visit Ukraine most recently in September and speak with some of the brave men and women valiantly defending their homeland, the notion that this is solely Putin's war is one that I would now reject. Of course, Western-induced regime change within the Russian Federation is not a sound basis for the United Kingdom's foreign policy. But even if it were, I do not believe that the idea mooted by some that new leadership in Moscow would necessarily bring the war to an end. In fact, I believe the opposite to be possible, with a new leader trying to burnish their nationalistic credentials by taking even greater destructive and indiscriminate military action. In effect, no Putin does not necessarily equate to no war. I give way.
Grateful to the Honourable Member for giving way. It was a pleasure to be with him in Kyiv earlier this year. He's making an incredibly important point, because sometimes we hear our allies say we have to make sure that Putin can't do this again. Actually, that is the wrong analysis. We have to make sure that Russia cannot do this again.
The Honourable Gentleman's absolutely right. Right Honourable Gentleman's absolutely right, and I'm going to try and prove that point somewhat further, because many of those in leadership roles that surround the current Russian president, such as the Chechen leader Kadyrov, who has suggested, of course, using a tactical nuclear weapon against Ukraine, they espouse rigid nationalist views, and they should not and cannot be absolved from blame for the invasion, as the term Putin's war may allow. It is also important to highlight that many towns in reoccupied Ukraine now have unmarked graves resulting from murders perpetrated by members of the Russian armed forces, with the Bucha massacre a poignant example that we all have a duty to remember and reflect upon. Reports are also rife of mass rapes, looting, torture, removal of children, and confiscation of vital foodstuffs. Again, all deeds done by soldiers and administrators of the occupying power. And it's clear to me that many people of the Russian Federation are up to their necks in heinous crimes committed during the ongoing war against the Ukrainian people. And the individual perpetrators must bear full responsibility for this and, of course, be prosecuted. So a case against those actively engaged in the invasion is clear. But what about the wider Russian people themselves? The problem is that by using the term Putin's war, it's possible to excuse, overlook or ignore that the war in all its gore and injustice remains very popular amongst most of the Russian population. And it's not just Putin and his cronies and his oligarchs. Some Russians, a small minority, have laudably taken a stand. Memorably and notably, Marina Ovsyannikova, who staged an on-air protest in March denouncing the war. Such defiance has, however, been more of an exception than the rule. Indeed, polling from within the Russian Federation continues to indicate strong support of over 70% for both the war and Putin amongst its populace.
I thank the Honourable Member for giving way to making an excellent speech, as ever. I mean, it is a complex issue, the extent to which the Russians support this war. And he's not wrong to say what he said, that it is still very popular. I just wonder if a slightly more generous way of putting it is that there is a hardcore against, very brave people, as he's outlined, There is a hardcore for the military bloggers, the nationalist community who are becoming increasingly concerned. But in the last 20 years, because of the amount of propaganda in the Russian society, most Russians know to avoid politics as an issue because you let the people in power get on with things. And so I don't think it's not so much popularity of the war as a sense of agnosticism towards politics and a sense of keeping away from it as a subject. Would you accept that point?
Well, I accept that it's a subject that we could go into in some degree, but I would make the point that of those Russians that have been leaving Russia and going to places like Armenia or Georgia or over 250,000 to Turkey, it is by no means proven that they are anti-Putin. In fact, a lot of research says that they're going to these countries because they either want to pursue their business activities and can't because of sanctions, or because they don't want to be called up on the reserve list. And so they leave, not because they don't like President Putin. So what I'm suggesting here is that at some point, systems and leaders need to take collective responsibility for the actions of the state and armed forces that operate in their name. For Russians, I would argue that that time has long passed. And if we agree that there should be collective responsibility, then we can make the moral case for collective sanctions, economic and travel. Travel restrictions, like those implemented by 6 EU states, are important as they practically reinforce the message of collective responsibility compared to economic sanctions, which will mainly apply only to wealthier people. As the situation currently stands, at the end of the war, whenever that may be, or indeed before, frozen assets across the West and other areas of the globe that have been sanctioned, including here in the United Kingdom, will be reclaimed by their owners. The public, including many constituents in Huntingdon that I have corresponded with about the situation in Ukraine, naturally assume that a frozen super yacht owned by a sanctioned individual will be sold with the proceeds used for reconstruction. We're talking here of some £18 billion of frozen assets, not including real estate, in the UK alone. This is not, alas, currently the case. And if the situation is not remedied, I believe an embarrassing political situation, not to mention a morally dubious one, beckons. So I think ministers should be prepared to consider, working with our allies, how frozen assets can be legally seized, sold, and the revenue put to work for Ukraine's rebuilding. The World Bank's assessment made in September is that Ukraine will need $349 billion for recovery and reconstruction. But I think it's worth saying that it's not just a question of law changes. It's also about adopting a more aggressive attitude within the existing system. For instance, when the FBI boarded the sanctioned Mr. Karamov's yacht Amadea in Fiji, it looks like the United States used the oligarch's maintenance of the yacht as a criminal breach of sanctions, which thereby allowed confiscation of the yacht. We could and should also be more assertive than we are. As for the possible law changes to facilitate the confiscation, the first is a revisiting of the Trading with the Enemy Act of 1939. During the Second World War, this act allowed the government of the day to confiscate assets owned by residents of enemy countries and British territories. The Act focuses squarely on the assets of any person or organisation of countries the United Kingdom is at war with. And thankfully, there has not, obviously, been much cause to review it since 1945. However, an amendment to the definition of war could provide a valuable basis for considering how Russian assets could be seized to the benefit of Ukraine and its reconstruction. Secondly, I refer to Canada's Budget Implementation Act, passed in June of this year, which includes amendments that allow for the forfeiture of property that is subject to a seizure or restraint order under the Special Economic Measures Act and their Justice for Victims of Corrupt Foreign Officials Act, their Sergei Magnitsky legislation. This is done under both regimes using forfeiture orders, allowing the relevant minister of the Canadian government to apply to a court to forfeit assets that have already been seized or frozen. A number of safeguards are rightly built into the legislation. So, for instance, any person who appears to have an interest in the property may be heard by the relevant court. A further possible avenue that I wish to highlight is one proposed by the Washington, D.C.-based New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy, who formulated a multilateral action model on reparations. In this model, the Institute draws 13 convincing conclusions which lay the basis for an international, effective and legal reparations and compensation scheme. The model builds on the relatively recent and practical example of the Kuwait Compensation Fund, which together with the UN Compensation Commission paid some $52 billion in compensation to 1.5 million claimants over 30 years following the Iraqi invasion in 1990. The establishment of the Fund and Commission was only possible due to agreement of those nations with a permanent seat at the UN Security Council. And of course, as an aggressor in Russia is an aggressor in Ukraine's case, its exact roadmap cannot unfortunately be followed. However, instead, the Institute makes the argument for working through the UN General Assembly instead of the Security Council. Madam Deputy Speaker, these avenues that I've highlighted today are but a number that I think are worthy of wider consideration. There are others. What is crucial, however, is that the conversation surrounding compensation and reparations now begins in earnest. Because just to continue saying that this is only Putin's war is no longer relevant or morally sustainable.